It's Arjun. With this week's video podcast, we want to start diving into the global macro picture for the power supercycle theme we're starting to talk about, what we're calling power surge. Now, there is a lot of enthusiasm here in the US about the prospects for accelerating power growth. We share that enthusiasm. But make no mistake, this is not just about what's happened in the US. This is, we think, going to be a global supercycle when it comes to power and energy more broadly. Now, some of the questions we're hoping to address this week, but also in future weeks in both videos and written posts is, will this AI mega theme, will continued wealth gains in key developing markets, as well as rising energy exports from what some are calling petro and electro states, will that combination re-accelerate global GDP? We've been in a pretty lackluster period the last 5 or 6 years. What are the prospects for that re-accelerating? And if it does re-accelerate, will that rising global GDP trend, will it lift all energy boats or just some? And will it lift these different boats by varying amounts? We're going to get into that question less so this week, but that is going to be one of the key topics going forward. And then finally, and certainly not last or least, is what are going to be the best investment opportunities for both corporates and investors across the broad energy and power space, industrials, and on the digital or technology side as well. There's going to be significant opportunity to be had there, and we'll dive into that. Now, we're not going to address all of that this week, or we'll be here for hours on end. We're going to more narrowly focus on what are the global trends in power versus oil demand. What you might think of as electricity generation power versus the fuel side of the business, which is oil, and we're going to be interchangeable between oil and liquids in how we talk about these things. Secondly, what are the regional variations in growth? Those are going to be the two focus areas for this week. And our key message is the idea that we're going to have a power supercycle, whether it's in the US or global, but somehow we're also going to have plateauing oil demand, which folks like the IEA and frankly, many of the public major oil company forecasts out there are calling for over the next decade. That to us is non-sensical. We are not going to, in our opinion, be having accelerating global power demand, but somehow plateauing oil demand. I think both are going to grow, especially if the power side re-accelerates global GDP. I think the second key thing that we're going to dive into, or the key message this week, is to what degree will the United States join some of these key emerging markets as a very pro-growth region, perhaps in contrast to its fellow rich countries, which thus far have not been pro-growth in nature. So I want to start by just looking at the long-term trends for GDP, power and electricity, we're going to use those terms interchangeably, and oil demand, which again, we're going to say oil, we mean liquids, so it includes black crude oil, natural gas liquids, biofuels, and a few other things as well. Transportation fuels plus petchems and then some. And first of all, this is a point we've generally made, and we can see it in this 40-year graph going back to 1986. It's annual growth rates, GDP's in blue, power generation's in black, oil demand or liquids demand growth is the gray line. These things have all moved together. Unsurprisingly, economic growth and energy growth are one and the same. You certainly thus far have not divorced these two things. One thing we'd note is over the last 40 years, the black line, which is power or electricity demand, has been growing faster than the oil or transportation fuel side for quite some time now. This is not a new phenomenon. And so while some are forecasting power to significantly outperform oil, that's actually been true for much of the last 40-year period. I think we want to highlight a couple different global GDP regimes, which we highlight with the dashed blue lines. Now, the scale on the y-axis, since we're showing all these other variables, is not going to do justice to how disparate these GDP regimes are. But let me just go through it. So from 1986 to 2003, global GDP averaged 3%. We're going to say that's not too hot, not too cold, kind of a base level of GDP growth. During the BRICs expansion that started in 2004 until 2018, global GDP accelerated and averaged 3.7%. Now, included in that was the great financial crisis, a very negative period for GDP. And so frankly, for much of that sort of decade plus period, global GDP was generally 4% or higher, in some years 4.5% and touching 5%. It was a very robust period for global economic growth, and therefore was also a very robust period for energy demand growth. And then more recently, since 2018, we've been in a slower period of global GDP, averaging 2.5%. Now that includes the extremes of COVID. If you strip out COVID, you're still kind of sub 3%, and in many years, a few percent, a few tenths of a percent below that. And that, unsurprisingly, has coincided with generally slower energy demand growth. And we're going to get in a second to what we think happens going forward. I think another key point we want to highlight when we look at these different GDP regimes is if you notice that when GDP expanded for the China BRICs expansion phase, power generation also expanded. It grew at a faster rate. And we'll maybe show it more clearly in the next graph that we're going to show here. Oil demand actually grew very consistently between the faster GDP period of the BRICS expansion 2004 to 18 and that prior era of just 3% GDP growth. And why is that? Oil prices quintupled. And that was our call. That was our big call at Goldman, what we call our super spike call. The namesake for this publication was the notion that in a world of limited OPEC spare capacity and disappointing non-OPEC supply growth, it was not going to be possible for oil demand to keep pace with the kind of GDP expansion we're going to have. And therefore, prices would have to rise sharply to cause demand destruction, or at least maybe more accurately, a limitation on the growth rate of oil demand. So it is true that the gray line looks like it grew no faster in the BRICS expansion phase than it did under the prior era of more modest growth. And that's because oil prices quintupled. That was the entire point. It took that price signal, the price reality of a quintupling oil prices to hold oil demand back. I think the third key point we want to make from here is kind of the most recent period, 2024. It's the far right end of this graph. And it looks like in 2024, electricity generation spiked, whereas oil demand decelerated. And it feeds into the call we're going to call the consensus narrative that power generation, the prospects are better, and oil demand, the prospects are worse. And we don't agree with that conclusion, as you all know. And we would note this is not the first time we've had this kind of disparate movement in any individual year. The prior periods were 1987, 1989, 2000, and 2018. So there has been plenty of precedent for individual years where power generation growth accelerated and oil demand growth slowed. And this also, by the way, is Energy Institute data. I think for 2024 in particular, it's quite possible the OPEC research numbers are more accurate, and you're still going to get a divergence, but it's not going to be quite as dramatic as what we see here. And I'm going to say for the decade ahead, this market sentiment that overwhelmingly says, hey, power's got a brighter future than oil, we expect power to grow faster than fuels. But the idea that we're going to have accelerating power and decelerating oil demand to the point where oil demand plateaus, no way. We push back hard on that. So sometimes the year-to-year numbers can be a little choppy. We actually have started to really enjoy looking at the rolling 10-year trends for demand for all the various energy areas. So what the graph here shows is the 10-year rolling growth rate. It's a percentage for both electricity generation power, if you will, as well as oil or liquids demand. The black is the power, the gray line is oil or liquids. And I think a few things to highlight here. First, power has structurally been growing faster on a rolling 10-year basis than its transportation fuels for we're showing 30 years of rolling 10-year growth. And again, just to clarify on that, if we look at, say, the 1995 data point, that would be the growth between 1985 and 1995. So for electricity generation, that grew a little over 35% over that 10-year period, whereas oil demand grew a little under 20%. And again, each year forward is the next is rolling 10-year periods. Now let me highlight that period of China BRICs expansion where you can see electricity generation accelerated during that period. So really for much of this history, for the entirety of the history we're showing here, 30 years of rolling 10-year growth rates, electricity generation grew between 30 and 40% on a rolling 10-year basis. And during the China BRICs expansion phases, it was at the upper end of that, 35 to 40% 10-year rolling growth rates. Whereas oil demand for most of this period grew between 15 to 20% on a rolling 10-year basis. And you can see it did not further accelerate in the China BRICs expansion period. And that was the point I made just a moment ago. oil prices quintupled, it would not have been possible for oil demand to grow at an accelerating clip. And that is why oil prices went from 20 to 100 to help limit the rate of oil demand down to what was available supply. And of course, if we fast forward to the most recent little period here, both power generation and oil demand have slowed consistent with the slowing global GDP growth. We think both are turning the corner, most obviously power generation, but we think oil demand will be as well, coming out of a slower period in a bottoming phase. And I think this will be the point of debate. Does only power grow at an accelerating growth rate going forward, or will oil as well? Our view is strongly on the side that oil will also grow. And in all likelihood, if we have sort of AI theme, emerging market wealth gains, we're going to see reacceleration in global GDP growth, at least back to what we had between 1986 and 2003, and perhaps better than that, heading towards what China BRICs expansion was, and that ought to help both power, but also help oil. I'd like to shift now to some regional analysis. And so this is the most recent 10-year period for a bunch of different regions. China, India, that's actually Asia Pacific overall, the Middle East, the world, Africa, United States, and some of the other rich country regions, Canada, Europe, and then just the European big four of France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And I think a few points. First, the obvious ones, China and India, dramatic growth as they are lifting, billion person scale economies out of poverty. China is now at least upper middle income. India is still moving up towards that kind of level. They've had massive growth in both power generation and in oil demand over the last decade, and that has lifted up Asia Pacific overall. I do want to call out Africa, which has actually grown power generation at a rate below what the world overall has done. And that frankly is pretty disappointing. Here you have another increment of 1.4 billion people that generally do not use very much energy, and they have struggled to get on that same sort of economic S-curve, which will lead to higher energy usage that we're seeing in China, India, and other parts of Southeast Asia. We have noted in some of our recent super spiked episodes and posts that there are some green shoots regarding Africa. It's a continent of 54, 55 countries, and for the first time, some of the upward revisions to oil demand are coming from that region. That is a very bright sign. And we suspect China's selling at a very low price or dumping renewables into Africa, improving their electricity generation, is also driving some of those oil demand numbers. So I think we'll be hopeful that Africa can do better going forward, but it does stand out as a region that has been at least disappointing in its history in terms of how much energy growth it's had. We'll spend more time on sort of the four rich regions we highlight here. It's really three regions and a little more detail in Europe specifically. But first and foremost, the United States has had, it's slow, but positive growth in both power generation and oil demand over the last decade. I'd contrast that with Canada, which has shrunk slightly in both metrics. Europe is kind of flat overall, but the EU big four, France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, they've had a pretty big erosion in both power generation and oil demand. And I think the question is, which can turn towards more pro-growth policies going forward? There's a lot of hope and optimism that the US is going to be one of the countries leading the charge on not just the AI theme, but kind of getting back to a pro-growth agenda. And you can see the consensus forecast for the next 10 years. That's what this sort of, it's supposed to be purple, it looks more pink shaded box is representing, which is the consensus forward forecast of a 2.5% plus or minus CAGR in power generation going forward, which if you compound that and add it up over a decade, is about 25 to 30% cumulative growth over the next 10 years is expected in US power demand. And that, that would be on par with Africa, a very impoverished region that has a lot of scope to improve its energy usage, did over the last decade. It's not going to put the US on par with, say, China or India, but that's a pretty substantial growth rate for a rich, developed economy. And I think the idea that the US could have 25 to 30% power generation growth, but somehow have flat or negative oil demand growth, those numbers don't go together. I suspect oil demand will be positive, in part driven by the increase in economic activity that comes from building out data centers, from reshoring, and all those kind of pro-growth initiatives that we're now seeing. And I think it's a big debate whether we'll see the same kind of policies in places like Canada and the European countries, the rich European countries, but I'm going to get to that in the next exhibit here. So here we're going to own in on the United States versus the EU Big Four, again, France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And a couple of things. These are the same graphs, rolling 10-year growth rates, starting with 1995, the 10-year period ending in 1995 through 2024 for, again, these two regions that we're going to compare and contrast. It's both power generation, the black line, and oil, or really liquids demand, which is the gray line. And first and foremost, the US has outperformed Europe over the entirety of this period, both historically and more recently. Both, though, have decelerated. And when you think back to the start of this period, that was the start of NAFTA. In the US, Ross Perot called it the giant sucking sound of factories and jobs leaving the US, in this case, going south of the border. At some point, China joined the WTO, and we had another round of outsourcing to China and other parts of Southeast Asia. And with that has come decreased and decelerating energy use, and it's pretty obvious on this trend. And it's been bipartisan. I don't think, it's probably worth saying right now, we hate partisan politics, we really do. And we find that it often clouds macro analysis of the energy sector. And so it has been a complete bipartisan trend here in the US to historically having supported both that sort of outsourcing and offshoring type trends that has resulted in this decreased energy usage in the US. And the same thing has, of course, occurred in Europe. I think what's noteworthy is in the most recent period, we're starting to see signs that the US is bottoming and getting back on a pro-growth track. And I think the debate is that going to happen in Europe or not? So if you look at Europe, their power generation on a rolling 10-year basis has been negative since 2014. So we're now in our 10th 10-year period consecutive of negative year-over-year power demand growth, and it's accelerating. That is absolute deindustrialization. It's offshoring. It's been good for not just China's industrial manufacturing base, but also China's coal sector. So to the extent some of this, not all of it, but some of it relates to climate policy, not obvious these kind of trends are good for the climate in the least, if that is something that you care about. But that point is going to be for a future video, not for today. Oil demand in, this is the European Big Four again, went negative in 2000 and has stayed negative since. In fact, it's showing some signs of exhaustion where in the last 3 years, oil demand has been less negative than actually power generation. This is on a rolling 10-year basis again. This is for the EU Big Four. And let's contrast it with the US. So the US, the tide seems to have turned in 2017. And we've shifted from, I'm going to say, that bipartisan consensus of trade deals are good, free trade is good, it's okay to offshore and have the jobs go elsewhere, to that coming to an abrupt change. It started with President Trump, and you can see the numbers turned under his first administration. Whether that's coincidence or due to his policies, we could certainly debate, but there's no doubt that from certainly a rhetorical and sentiment perspective, that's when the rhetoric of we need to reshore and rebuild our manufacturing base started. But I will say it continued under President Biden. So some of you like Trump, some of you definitely don't. And same thing is true for Biden. Some of you like him, some of you don't like him. The rhetoric can often sound very different. In terms of the actual numbers, you'd be hard pressed here to figure out who is president if you were just looking at the numbers. It's increasingly in the US a bipartisan consensus that we do need to reshore some of our jobs back here, and that we need to get back to having a pro-growth agenda for the United States. And you're starting to see it in the numbers. It was interrupted by COVID, but I'm going to say, I think I feel personally pretty encouraged that these numbers are starting to turn the corner in a positive way in the United States. And I'll be honest, I'm not as hopeful about the European Big Four. It probably warrants its own deep dive to say what can or should they do. I think in the US, we're seeing a real positive turn back towards pro-growth, reshoring economic policies, and we have the kind of energy system that can support that. That's not obviously the case in those European Big Four economies. The last picture I want to show is these numbers on actually an absolute basis. So this is simply electricity generation, but I want to compare the absolute volume of growth between China, India, the United States, and those EU Big Four countries. So this is just electricity generation It's rolling 10-year growth rates of absolute volume growth. It's in terawatt hours. This also comes from the Energy Institute. The red line is China, and they have just had mind-boggling growth. It has been simply impressive and immense. In the last 10-year period, the total terawatt hours of growth in China is about what the US produces each year. China has added a US power market equivalent in just the last 10 years. That is a stunning number. Now, in the case of the United States, I mentioned a few graphs ago that the expectation the US would be that the US would get back to a 2.5% growth in power consumption, which if you translate that into absolute numbers is over 1,000 terawatt hours of growth on a 10-year basis. And the last time the US came anywhere close to that level of absolute volume growth on a rolling 10-year basis was the late 1990s, before all this offshoring and deindustrialization trends kicked in. And frankly, the absolute volume growth, if you model this out, would actually be a little higher than what was achieved in those late 90s periods. But let's just use round numbers here. Now, I will say that, as I think everyone here knows, I am not a power sector expert. So how plausible it is, how we should think about how you divide up the energy sources. We need to do more work on that. We accept all feedback on the topic. We certainly accept feedback on what would need to happen such that on a rolling 10-year basis, we can get back to the kind of 1990s level of absolute growth and perhaps even a little bit better than that. I think those are some big challenges. I'm not going to sit here and say it can or cannot be done. I would like to understand what needs to happen to enable it. And then I think we're going to spend some time digging in. How do we think about the different sources of power, whether that's natural gas, nuclear, solar, wind, perhaps newer stuff like enhanced geothermal, hydro is part of the mix, and what role, if any, coal is going to play. I would also point out that it was as recently as 2009 that on an absolute basis, the US was actually still growing faster than India. And to me, all that says is that it's true that as a rich country, the sort of wealth gain aspect of emerging market development, we shouldn't expect to be repeated. But we do have a chance to have just general economic growth in this country. I think it's something that, as an American, we should feel very good about. I think India's worth mentioning. Its percentage growth is very impressive, on par with China. But on an absolute basis, India today sits kind of where China was in 2002. Now, is India going to experience the kind of dramatic S-curve improvement that, for why we called it the China BRICs expansion of 2004 to 2014? I don't know. The nature of Indian economic growth, I think, is going to be very different than China. I don't expect it to be as energy intensive or as export or property market oriented. India has a more diversified economy. It has as much services as it does sort of export impulses. It has a technology economy. And dare I say, it's going to be healthier economic growth. Maybe that's a judgmental term. But as a result, it's probably not going to be as energy intensive. That said, India has a long way to go on its energy uses, and we don't even have on this graph here the rest of Southeast Asia or the continent of Africa. So I think there's a lot to look forward to. And our point again would be that these trends in power generation are global, and our message is power demand. I think we feel very, very good about, not just in the U.S. but globally as well. That I think raises the prospects of reaccelerating global GDP growth. And if we get that, and as we get that, that's going to be positive for oil demand growth as well. And really, that is the key message we want to leave people with today. So we'll end this video on a personal note. I am recording this on Tuesday, November 11th, which is Veterans Day here in the US. And I always want to take the opportunity, especially recording on a day like today, to remember all the veterans out there. Over the course of my career, certainly at Veriton and some of my board activities that I'm involved with, I've had the great fortune to meet some of our most prominent veterans of our country, people who are absolute national heroes. And we all need to be thankful for those kind of people, getting the bad guys and keeping us safe. I've also had the opportunity, though, to interact, meet, and work with folks at a variety of different levels who have served our country as well, whether it's a really close former colleague and close friend of mine from Goldman Sachs, some of my best friends growing up, and then folks I've met along the way, including a PGA Hope event I did in DC several years ago. Veterans are amazing people. And I'm almost talking about how, as a lucky one billionaire, we need to remember how fortunate we are for all the energy and economic lifestyles we enjoy and take for granted. That also should apply to our feelings towards our veterans. And so I want to say thank you to all the veterans, all the ones that I know and all the ones who I don't know. Thank you for your service and for keeping us safe. Thank you.